Hello and welcome to my latest video. This time I'm going to be showing you how to paint the demon eye on Mortarion's second wing. So obviously you've seen how to paint the first eye and it's there on the screen, and there's the two wings set up, and I've painted all the details, well not all the details but most of the details in for the second wing, just enough so that I can now paint the eye itself. So I'm going to be covering how to paint the iris, the pupil and the white of the eye as well as some reflections and things like that. You might find it odd why I'm going to say how to paint the pupil when obviously the pupil is an empty space, but as we're going to see now, I'm going to paint the pupil as the symbol of Nurgle as well, so that'll just link the design a little bit more to Nurgle rather than just being a cool looking eye. So I'm starting off just with the three circles of Nurgle, and I'm painting them using Mephiston red. It doesn't have to be a perfect shape. You do want it roughly in the middle of the eye. Obviously, I should mention as well that I've painted in the eye, the iris as a big black circle. You may look at it and think it's not perfectly round. It's a little bit difficult on the video to show it, but because the wing has curves, it sort of very soft curves going in and out. Depending on how the angle you hold the wing at, it changes the shape of how it looks. So it is mostly round. It's just well, it's not quite perfectly round, but I'll tweak that as I go along anyway. But there is a slight optical illusion due to the shapes on the wing itself. So here you can see I'm just kneading out the pupil a little bit, and it's the inner shape that's important. So you can see that on the outer shape of the Nurgle sign that it's a little bit wonky. Don't worry about that because I'm actually going to rub that out later as I go along. It's the inner shape, and even that itself will change as I progress. You might also notice on the eye there are small imperfections in the wing where there's detail that has been on it where I've shaved it off, but next to that detail there are indentations. Now I could have spent a lot longer and filled all those in with putty and sanded it down and made it perfectly smooth, but actually I find that they're quite useful just for adding more detail onto the wing, so you can use those and highlight them and use them as part of the freehand and things, which you'll see as we go along. I'll be adding all sorts of details. So now what I'm doing is painting the lines coming directly out from the iris, from the pupil. I'm sticking with Mephiston red. The whole of the eye isn't going to be red. It's going to have lots of colours on, but I'll be painting those on over the top of the red. So these are like base lines. They don't need to be perfectly straight, and honestly you don't want them to be perfectly straight because it'll just look a bit weird. And don't worry about making them too fine as well, because you're going to be painting over them, things like that. It'll be easier to see them and just work with them if they're solid lines. But also you want it to be quite visible. Now I can paint the lines much thinner than this, and what happens is when you paint it much thinner is you actually lose some of the visible detail. So there's kind of, you don't want to, basically I'm just saying just don't paint the lines too thin. Do them working out from the centre, and you can add slight wobbles to them and things like that, because you don't want it to be with a perfectly straight lines it's very boring, but having a little bit of a wobble on the lines, and even just sending them off slightly, curling round and things like that. If you ever look at a reference to a real eye, you should see that the detailing on the iris is completely, it goes really random all over. There's all sorts of different lines, so you can't go too wrong. It's just a case of trying to make it look interesting. And don't worry as well about going over the tops of lines and crossing over them, because again, if you look at reference to real eyes, that these lines that come at that are in the iris are they go all over the place basically. So there are going to be a lot of lines in this video. It's quite a lot of line work basically. There's not that much in the way of glazing with the eye itself. The glazing comes at the end for kind of the shadows and giving it shape and form. Little flip of the wing there you saw, that shows I've sort of painted the rear of it. I am planning some complicated freehands for the back bit as well, but I have to concentrate on getting the front done first. So also on this iris, you should see that I painted the lines quite spread out to start with, all the way round. And what this does is it allows me to much more easily make sure the lines are all going from the centre outwards, because what you don't want is, as you go along, having all the lines slightly tilt to one side, and as you get further and further they'll start tilting more and more, and eventually it'll get to a stage where it just looks really bad. So they're guidelines basically. So if you start off putting, like, say 8 lines or quarter, like if you quarter the thing and then turn it into eighths and then fill in the lines in between, you're much less likely to go wrong and start having all the lines veer off in one direction. I mean, if you want them all to veer off in one direction, that might be interesting, but you've really got to make it work as a composition piece and not do it accidentally. Also, you should notice as well that the lines aren't all evenly spaced out. Some of them are bigger, some of them are smaller, and then so as I said, all those kind of details will make it more interesting as we go along. So here, what I'm doing is using Vallejo model color black. Because that was the black that I used to paint the black circling to start with, and I'm just rubbing out the original line for the pupil, and also I'm just filling in some of the imperfections and indentations in the wing, because as I mentioned, they're going to be turned into part of the freehand design. But what I'm mainly doing is separating out all these lines, because obviously I painted in that 3-circle design for the Nurgle symbol, and I don't want that hard line going around it. I want it to be kind of a rough outline, and so I'm basically just using the black paint as a rubber, and I'm painting in between the lines that have been painted on, so you're not making this shape smaller, it's staying the same size, it's just looking a little bit softer because it doesn't have that hard red line going all the way around it. Looks a bit like Mickey Mouse here. In some cases, like here, where there's quite a lot of faults in the detail on the wing, it makes it a bit harder to be perfectly neat on the lines, but don't worry about it too much, because all these imperfections, as I said, make it more interesting, and you can work with them and highlight them up and incorporate them into the design. So it's not really an issue, but don't try to fight them. If you find that the detail isn't working, just leave it and move on. So here I'm using Wild Rider Red, and I'm going to start putting some very loose high level marks on. By high level, what I mean is that there's kind of 2 layers to the iris, well, in my case anyway. So I'll be painting So and what will happen is it'll separate like kind of a top layer from a bottom layer of these lines going out from the pupil, and that's why I'm using a lighter colour, so it makes a stronger mark. But also the lines, some of them go back onto the upper level, and particularly the those points in between the three circles that will eventually all join in the middle to really emphasise the three individual shapes. But so as I mentioned, some of those lines will cross over from the lower level to the higher level, but as we go along, you'll see what I mean anyway. It gets a bit complicated to describe. Apologies for my hair sticking in the way. Again, with this freehand, I tend to have to get quite close to it to see what I'm doing, so it's very hard to just focus on the have the camera just focus on the model without my head getting in the way. There you can see on some of the details I'm actually turning it into an arrow, and that's part of what I was talking about before, is that the lines, they come out from the pupil, they sometimes join together, they cross over each other, all kinds of things like that. You just have to do those as you see fit, kind of like if you think it might be interesting, then do it. Because it's so early on in the design work as well, don't be afraid to have a little play around and try something if you think it might be interesting, because basically all you've done is put red lines on, so it's really easy to fix any mistakes at this point. So there you can see exactly that. I've just gone back with the Vallejo model colour black and just tweaked a little bit there where the paint had gone slightly wrong. So here you can see I'm doing some small lines close together, and they're not distinct, and what that's doing is basically just lightening the whole area, and then I can then go back and make the lines even stronger on top of that, because I want different strengths of colour around the piece. It'll make more sense as I go along as more colours are added and things like that. While I'm painting this, the only reference that I have actually is the original wing that I've used, and the reason for that is, although I'm doing the designs very differently, I still want the general look to to make it look like it works as two eyes, just with different designs on. So here you can see again using the Wild Rider red, going over the top of some of those marks and making the lines much brighter. So you'll see on these lines, sometimes I go over the line that's already there, other times I won't, because this upper layer it's a completely separate layer. I keep saying upper layer, I'm hoping people understand what I mean by the upper layer and lower layer. There's like two layers of red lines coming from the pupil, and the upper layer is the one that's on the outside of that line going all the way round. The other thing to remember when painting all these details and things on as well is that obviously there's going to be highlight points and reflections painted on top of the eye, and shading as well to give the eye some shape. And the reason I say you have to be aware of that is because you could spend ages painting on some details and then just completely paint over them with shadows and highlights. The brush that I'm using is a size 0 from Artist Opus. So, I mean, again, use whichever brush preference you want, but I found that size just about right for this kind of work. Part of the reason for that as well is actually having the slightly thinner brush. I'm not talking about the point. You always want the point on the brush for doing detailed work, but having a thinner brush means you can do longer draw strokes, so you can push the brush a bit harder without the line thickening out. The larger the brush you get, the quicker it thickens out as you push harder. Obviously, because it's a thicker brush, so you get that wider mark. Whereas this, I can do a longer draw line, keeping it thin. And again, all these marks are just being done with Wild Rider Red. So now I'm going to use some blue. Well, I say blue. It's actually, I think it's Sotek green. Which is kind of like a bluey green colour. It doesn't matter too much which colours actually you use. I've used the blue to contrast with the red because the blue is going to be highlighted. If you've watched my videos on the Night Haunt, where I've used light blues, and again it was a Sotek green and Lothern blue, I think it was, and then using the strong red colour with the dark in between, things like that, it gives a really nice contrast. And also I just fancy doing it because I've been using those colours on the Night Haunt already. And what you're going to see here as I add different colours and things is I'm going to go over lines and not bother cleaning my brush off, and it's going to mix colours together. You're going to see all sorts of variations just because I've got a bit of red on the brush, and then I dip it in some blue and things like that. So here you can see where I was talking about the faults on the wing and how they're being highlighted, and that will then become part of the eye, or the Eye Freehand rather. So one of the most difficult things on this is actually to make the design work. The painting itself is actually fairly simple. The lines don't have to be perfectly straight. You have a lot of leeway with things like faults. As long as the lines tend to flow into each other, then the line work isn't that difficult. And as I said, the lines don't have to be that thin either. So it's not a great challenge to do the line work. It's just making the design itself work. So you're looking at the aesthetics of it, and that will be down to the colours that you choose and the shapes that you put down. And the shapes will work, as I said, because if you make them flow into each other, then they'll work nicely. So you can see here that the sort of marks that I'm putting in, they kind of curve into each other rather than being hard lines with the right angles and things like that. Right angles are very jarring. Anything with a hard edge on it is very jarring to see, whereas the soft curves that all flow into each other makes it much more natural looking and organic. Now some of these lines that I put in I'll change as they go along because they're not quite perfect, but they will eventually be made to work. You can see I'm just slowly edging those lines up towards the centre of the pupil, so that the three connecting lines will eventually join, and that will emphasise the Nurgle sign. And every now and then, like I'm doing now actually, I'll dip the brush back into the Vallejo model colour black, and I'll just tweak the design a bit, probably reinforce the upper and lower levels again, or just rub the odd little bit out, just so that some of the definition for the details pops out more. So here you can see, or maybe just about see anyway, that I've put in a little screaming face. It's on the right of the screen there of the iris, and I'm putting another one here now. So all it is just two black eyes and a black screaming mouth. It's just a minor detail, but I thought it'd be interesting as part of the demonic eye to have the three little screaming faces on. So there's going to be another one, and each one goes underneath the centre point that goes into the middle. Later on in the video I'll pick them out a bit more by putting small yellow dots. I'm not sure how clear they are in the final piece, but again it's just a little touch that I thought might be interesting. You can see as I'm holding it as well, the reason why I haven't painted up around the edges of the wing yet, I wanted to get all the complicated details in the middle of the wings painted before taking it all out to the edge. So I'll be painting the backs of the wings first before painting the edges as well, because I just don't want to rub all the details off after painting them. So you can see when I'm applying this blue, I'm not actually doing it in strong lines. I'm kind of, it's almost glazing over the top. It's not really, it's not a glaze, so the paint's a bit thicker, and I can pick out lines if I want, but just doing rough marks has turned the orangey line from the Wild Rider Red into a bluish kind of greenish. As I say, Sotek green is a sort of a bluey green. If you look on the wet palette, you can see where I've been using the Sotek green. Next to that is also Temple Guard blue, and then again Temple Guard blue with a bit of white added, so as a final highlight for the blue colours. I've managed to desync the wet palette video from the main video. So what you'll find when doing this is there's a lot of refinement and a lot of going backwards and forwards and just tweaking bits to see if they work. Just working on the little screaming face a bit more there. I've painted the screaming faces, so they're not obviously screaming faces. I mean, you can see them with the two eyes and the mouth, but I wanted them to still look like they're part of the shape of the iris design. You can see on the wet pad I'm just adding a bit more water to the paints as they dry out. So here I'm using the Temple Guard blue, and I'm just picking out some of the lines that have already been painted in with Temple Guard green, not Temple, Sotek green, sorry. As I mentioned, don't worry too much about the exact colours. You can get the same effects that I'm painting using all sorts of different paints. I just happen to quite like using GW paints. I also like Vallejo paints, but there's all sorts of different ones you can use. I tend to not use scale 75 quite so much for freehand. I don't find the marks they make are quite as sharp. They're a much softer paint, designed for a different style of painting, whereas the Games Workshop and Vallejo I find are much easier for fine line work. So here you can see I added a bit more of the blue, the highlights, and then some of that white added to the Temple Guard blue as well, just to push some of the details even more. I also, as you might be able to tell looking at the red, I went back a little bit with the Mephiston red and did some very soft marks just to tone down the orange look a little bit. I'll be going over the reds again and they'll highlight up again, so it won't make a massive amount of difference, but I just I didn't want to completely lose the red, because I'd made a lot of marks with the Wild Rider red at this point. Here you can see the really nice contrast between the dark red and the light blue. What happens is, as I keep going backwards and forwards and just, tweaking colours and things like that, it all adds more layers to the paint, and as long as you're keeping the marks quite simple and the paint thin, it's not going to build up you're not going to build up rough textured paint on it too much, but you are going to add a lot of detail to it with the separate layers, and it just makes it look so much more interesting having all these layers on rather than just solid blocks of colour. So here I am again, back to the Wild Rider red. It's a fantastic colour really, it makes quite strong marks while still being a fairly reddish colour. As I say, I'm not entirely sure why they call it red, because it looks quite orange to me. So here it's looking more like the screaming faces have got really pointy hats on. Apart from this guy who's slightly to the right of his pointy hat, but you can't have everything. Here you can see I'm doing these very small marks, and this just blends the lines together. So it's kind of like glazing mixed with dry brushing, because the paints aren't watered down to glaze consistency, but the very light marks of the paintbrush it only puts a very small amount of paint on the model, and if you do lots of small ones, it does like a very thin coat of paint. That basically what I'm doing is so I get a level of transparency, so you can see where I put all those marks down. You can still see the lines going through, but it makes them look closer together and just blocks in that colour a bit more. So rather than it being just lots of very strong individual lines, it gives the impression of lots and lots of lines. So here I am just emphasising those faults in the wing a bit more, and tweaking the screaming face. So you can see as I keep going along. So there was a time skip there. There wasn't actually any more painting done. What happened was it's a separate day's painting I did over multiple days. So here you can see there's a new wet palette with all fresh paint on there, and I'm using I think it's Zamesi Desert just to paint in some yellow dots for eyes in the screaming faces. Now you can see on the wet palette, obviously to the left of the Zamesi Desert, there is some really strong yellow, and that's Yriel yellow, and I will use that to highlight the eyes later on, but I just wanted to play it a bit safe before going straight to Yriel yellow, so the Zamesi Desert is a bit more muted. So also on the wet palette, above the Yriel yellow is Moot green and P3 Iosen green. There is a Games Workshop equivalent, and that is Warpstone Glow. So you can use either of those. It's basically a nice green colour that I can lay on top of the red. Just again for a bit more some interesting colour. I'm not laying it down as a strong colour, and I'm not using it to, it's not being completely green, it's just to change the tone of the red. basically just wanted to get that some green tinge in there to again emphasise the Nurgle aspect of this eye. So here I'm going for the Moot green. This will be obviously a much brighter mark. You can see I'm being very tentative with how I'm applying this green paint, because strong green marks on this would look quite gross, so, and not in a good way. So yeah, I'm just carefully applying them just for slight hints of green, basically. I don't want the iris to look like it's Christmas. A few times you may have seen the camera wobble. Every time that happens, that's because I've headbutted the camera. So here you can see that green that I applied, it's only very subtle. You can also see that in some places I've applied so many of these small marks next to the lines that it's almost become just a soft, hazy transition. And again, that's just to make it more interesting. So you have some parts with quite obvious strong lines and other parts that are much softer and blended together. And again, it's going to give me options as I progress just to add more detail on top. So here's a good example of that on this blue that I'm painting on. Some of it is, you can see the strong lines, and then just next to it you've got the softer lines blurred into it. And this is Temple Guard blue again, is the light blue. I haven't added any white. There's a small daub of paint on the wet palette there. I will add white at some point to that one as well, but it's a fresh palette and I haven't got around to mixing that yet. This is an important part as well. You can see me throughout the video as I'm turning this piece round, and I keep putting my thumb on the areas that are already painted. I had given that a coat of matte varnish beforehand just to give it a bit of protection, but even having done that, you have to be really, really careful if you're doing it while painting, because you can get paint on your fingers and you can smear it on the model as well as damage it. I wouldn't recommend touching it like that. I'm just being a bit lazy. Maybe cover it in cling film or something like that, or wear gloves, because you will damage the paintwork if you handle it too much. So I'm just going back and using the Vallejo model colour black. That's what I was just adding the water to then, and now I'm just tweaking some of the details. You don't have to use the Vallejo black, you can use any black you want. I like the Vallejo one because it's matte, but I'll give the whole thing a coat of matte varnish at the end anyway, because I don't want any variations in the paints. So certain paints have different levels of shininess, and depending on how the light catches it, it can make it look a bit weird. So I prefer to keep with this freehand to keep all the paint qualities the same, while still being able to use different paints at the time while I'm using it. So that's why I can use all these use the different brands of paints. So I'm just going back over it and darkening down and picking out the lower level areas of the iris, picking out the edges basically and shading them in with some gentle brush marks. The screaming faces are a little bit more clear now, as well as I've changed the line weight around them, so the softer lines around them allow for the darker lines on the eyes and the mouth to stand out more, as well as the obviously the yellow eyes. It might look like I've spent quite a long time going over these lines, and there's not a great difference between about 10 minutes into the video and where I'm at now. But it does all make a difference in the end. The problem is that the eye doesn't come to life until you add the highlights at the end. So you might find that you're getting a bit frustrated, and it can look interesting, but it still looks very flat. Now the different layers, the different levels of these lines coming from the pupil on the iris, they will add a certain level of 3D-ness to it, but it's still flat because there's no curve to the eye. You don't get the curve until you put the shadows on, and you don't get the life come into it until you put the highlights on. So don't worry if it just looks flat and you're getting frustrated, because it's not until the end that it's basically it all comes together. So here you can see I'm actually using the Zamesi Desert, the same colour that I used to put the highlights on the eye, not the highlight, I mean just paint the eyes on themselves actually, on the screaming faces, just to extend the details and sharpen the details on the red sections a bit as well. You have to be a bit careful when you're doing this, because every time you put a different colour on top of the red, you're taking away that red and making it not red anymore. So if you want to keep that red, to keep the dark red, to keep the contrast in against the light blue, so be very careful doing painting over the red. So here you can see I did just a little bit more in between the takes there. So I've extended the lines towards the centre there, so you can now much more clearly see the three circles of the Nurgle symbol. So here I'm using the Yriel yellow just to pull out the eyes a little bit brighter. It won't make a massive difference, but it's just to emphasise the detail there. And again, just using Temple Guard blue just to soften in a few of these lines. Try and you know, make the different colours work together next to each other, rather than just being blocks. To some extent, when you put the glazing on and things like that, it will bring everything together anyway, but it doesn't hurt just to spend a little bit of time to make the colours flow together. Every time you see on the wet palette with my brush hovering over different colours, I'm trying to decide which colour to go for. So again, back on the Zamesi desert, and I'm pulling in some of these lines. Now I'm actually using the Yriel yellow just to highlight as well. So this is in the area where there's already been some green applied. So the yellow on the green works quite nicely. Now I'm just highlighting a little bit more the lines going into the centre, just to really pick them out. Be very delicate when you apply the Yriel yellow as well, because it makes a very bright mark. Now it won't give great coverage or overall, like if you wanted to colour the whole black area in and you painted the yellow on top, you're going to make a mess. But if you want to do a very fine line using Yriel yellow, you can make a very sharp, bright yellow line. And again, I've just gone back to using the model colour black just to tweak the details again, make sure there's some separation between some of the lines. Every time you see me pause and take the brush off the screen to the centre, I'm just wiping it on my thumb again. For all this line work, you never ever want to use the paint straight from the palette, because it'll make a blob when the paint touches the model. Always rub the paint on something. So that's why you see most painters, when their thumbs are covered in paint, it's because they're rubbing the brush on your thumb just to draw that paint along the length of the brush and make sure that the tip hasn't got a blob of paint on the end, basically. So what I'm doing now is I'm painting in the white of the eye. For this I'm using P3 Rhinflesh, and I've got Kislev flesh on the palette as well. You don't need that much Kislev flesh. The base colour before I started, I think, was Kislev flesh and a bit of Cadian Fleshtone as well, but the base colour doesn't matter too much, because it's going to, obviously I want the eyes to be quite light, going up towards white. So Rin flesh is the main colour, and that's the fleshy, the one that I've sucked the brush in just then on the wet palette. And the way I'm painting it is to have it, the white of the eye, lighter at the bottom, around the lower part of the iris, because the top section of the white of the eye, and indeed the top of the iris and all the whole length of the eye, is going to be glazed down. And also, something that I find helps a lot when I'm painting these sorts of things is because I want the eye to be rounded, and the marks I paint down, I paint in the direction of the shape of the eye, the way that I want it to curve, and it just kind of helps subtly shape the eye so it's not flat, but it's got that kind of rounded look to it. You can already see, just by adding that small amount of Rin flesh, that the iris is already starting to work a bit more nicely. Which is another point to mention. So I've already mentioned how it comes to life when you add the shape, you add the highlights and the shading around the whole of the eye. But just to emphasise that a bit more, things on the freehand tend to work, like they all work together, it works as a whole piece. So what happens is when I'm painting the freehand that would be around the eye, all these little fleshy bits, they look kind of interesting, but they don't work until the eye's put on top. And in the same way as the eye wouldn't be impressive without all these fleshy bits around it, the fleshy bits are enhanced by having the eye in the middle of them. So it really is a case of the piece doesn't work until it all comes together. So here I'm just using a bit of white, ceramite white, right at the very bottom of the white of the eye. So that really light part of the bottom of the whites of the eye, that's really added to the high contrast level of the iris itself. So all the dark areas now contrast really strongly against the white. The colours pop out a bit more, but also it helps the lighter parts on the eye, pop out as well. So now I'm going to use Doombull brown, and carefully start to add a little bit more transition to this white of the eye. Now it looks quite a strong mark at the minute, but obviously I'm going to blend that in. Here you can see, so I still had some Doombull brown on the brush, and I just dipped it into a bit of the Rin flesh, and it just lets you blend it on the model. You can see it looks a little bit rough at this stage, but I'm not too bothered by the white of the eye, because once I put the glazes on top and some of the other details, it'll work. Especially because when I put the red veins coming over it as well, and some of the other details later, it tends to hide some of the faults. So don't worry too much about making mistakes on this. So actually what's happening here is I'm using the Doombull brown as a glaze. I've realised I'm using the wavy that comes with the red grass wet palette. It's got some little well palettes, and I've made a glaze of the Doombull brown, and I haven't managed to capture that in the video. So it's obviously quite a heavy glaze due to the marks I'm making. They're not super light, but so that's basically what's happened. I've used Doombull brown that's glazed down, so it's quite watery. That's why the marks were. I was able to do all those kind of marks that were kind of like pushing the paint around on the model. Right, so now I'm painting on the red veins onto the white of the eye. And I'm using Mephiston red, and all it is are just very, very fine, basically lightning bolts. So sort of wiggly lines going from the iris to the edges of the eye into the tear ducts and things like that. Try and keep them coming from the centre of the eye outwards, but it doesn't matter if they're a bit wonky and stuff like that, because if you ever look at the veins in the white of an eye, they tend to go all over the place. So I was going to say you have to judge it by eye, but that's a terrible pun. Don't worry as well about if you get like a big not a big, but like little blobs of paint and things like that, because they're just large. The blood vessels aren't perfectly even lines that you get on the eye either. Alright, so here I actually decided to put the wavy on the screen so you can actually see what I'm doing with the glazing. So it's going to be a combination of Rhinox hide and Doombull brown, and eventually there will be some black on there as well. You can also see that I'm actually going to be glazing along the lower edge. You've got to be very careful along the lower edge. It's just to create a soft shadow. You don't want to make the white go dirty and things like that, and you don't want to make it too big anyway, because it'll, it just look weird and you'll lose that shape. So you can see that I'm actually using the Rhinox hide to glaze straight over the iris as well. It just makes it like a softer transitions in the eye, kind of ties the piece together as well, because I've used Rhinox hide glazes all over the wing. So it helps to tie it all together. And I've mentioned this enough times in videos now, but what I'm doing is, when I'm applying the glaze, is I put the paintbrush into the wet palette, load up the brush, then I'm rubbing it on some kitchen roll off to the side, just off screen, so that most of the paint actually leaves the brush, and when I apply it again on the model, it just does a very soft kind of, it's almost like a dry mark when it applies. It dries very quickly. So what you should notice is when I first apply the glaze, it looks very dark, and then as it dries it gets lighter, and that's purely because it's the water content when it touches. For an experiment, if you find something that's matte, you put a bit of water on it, it'll look darker. So that's what's happening here. It's mainly the water that makes the mark look dark when it's applied, not so much the amount of pigment. So here I'm putting some details onto the eye, and the idea is that I'm extending some of these veins, the eyelash veins, straight onto the eyeball itself. I thought that'd be quite an interesting little, almost horrific type thing to add. So again, pushing that kind of Nurgle chaotic element. And the reason I can do this now is, or had to wait until this point to do it, is because I put the shading on. So you remember as well where I mentioned putting the shading around the lower section of the eye, so it's just got that very fine shadow underneath it. It just creates that darker area, so I can paint the light line on top of it, basically. And I'm using Cadian Fleshtone as the main colour, because that's the colours that were used on the veins, and then carrying them over. And then I'll be using some Vallejo model colour Ivory to highlight it, and that's the colour, and some Rin Flesh as well, because that was already used on the whites of the eye. It's a bit of a mash between the eye and the fleshy details from the wing, because I didn't actually use Rinflesh on the wing, but because I've used it on the eyeball, I thought if I kind of used that on some of the strands sort of between the eyeball and the wing itself, it sort of blends it together. You see this line here actually goes across into the iris. You have to be a little bit careful when you do this, because the colour is very different from the colours already on the iris, so you have to use very fine, gentle marks. You can see just connecting them up to the lines on the iris. I've actually still got to highlight them a little bit more, just to get a bit more shape on. But I didn't do that in this video, unfortunately. And I've still got to decide if it's going to be worth doing it or not in the end. Because I could spend a lot longer still doing these eyes, but obviously I've still got to paint the whole model to go with it to make a nice Mortarion piece. And sometimes it can be a case of you spend so long trying to refine and make something as good as possible, and it's just but people just won't be able to see those details, so it's a case of weighing up if it's worth the effort. So there you can see all the lines going from the veins into the iris. Now it's painting the highlights on the reflections. Now actually I had a slight issue with this main reflection to start with. I was using pale blue grey. It's an airbrush colour by Vallejo, and what happens was it's in the top of the wet palette. It's the lightest grey in the centre. And it had dried out a bit, and for some reason the airbrush paint dries out quite quickly on the wet palette. So, but I'd added some water to it, but that had changed the properties of the paint a little bit, and it just wasn't making the marks the way I wanted. So what happens is I'll paint this, spend a bit of time doing it, and then I'll put some more paint on the wet palette with the same colour, but because it'd be fresh paint. So we'll see how it goes in the video anyway. But so I'm also copying the other wing for the highlights, try and get them roughly the same anyway. Because obviously with the two eyes you'd get the same thing reflected both eyes, to roughly anyway. So you can see here, as I'm getting a little bit frustrated with the grey. So I'm using the white obviously, but the grey hadn't left the marks I wanted, so it wasn't a strong enough colour. So I'm applying the white, but I'm still getting the. You can still see the dark marks underneath. But it's slowly getting there. So here you can see I went back with the Vallejo model colour black and I cut into the shape to get those the shape, the rough kind of wobbly finger shapes, and you can see on the wet palette in the top left there's now a small daub of Vallejo model colour pale blue grey, and below that there's some fresh white as well. So you can see the centre of the highlight is really bright now. It's almost pure white, and then it goes to the pale blue grey at the edges. Now obviously these are still, the highlights are very hard and they have to be glazed in a bit yet. You also, below the big curve highlight, there's some small dots on there. Those make quite a big difference. So here I'm using Rhinox hide to glaze the edges. This will soften it and make the highlight a bit shorter. It'll just make everything look a lot neater and blend it all together more. When glazing these edges as well, make sure you don't go over the white in the middle of the highlight, because it'll just make it dirty and make a mess. You want that white to be really bright white. That's the main it's the main eye-catching part of the eye. If I'm putting a glaze on and the paintbrush goes out of the screen, I'm using Abaddon black glazes. And that's what I'm doing here at the top of the eye. So the contrast is really high. It's almost black. As you tilt the eye a bit, you can see the details very roughly in the shadows, but it's almost black against the white of the highlight. But you should be able to see now how that highlight at the top, it just brings so much life to the eye and gives it like a much more 3D effect. So now it's just the small highlight points, and this is to show the wetness of the eye. So you don't want these to be perfectly shaped dots. Also, make sure that there is a dark line either side of these white marks, just for the contrast, and to make sure they stand out. Well, it's the same thing, but you know what I mean. So if you can, so what I've done a little bit there is use some of the pale blue grey as well as the white. You don't have to use pale blue grey, but just adds a tiny little bit of diffusion to the light. But you can't, I mean, it doesn't make a massive difference. You can't really see it that well. It's just and it is highlighting the tear duct as well with pure white. That just makes it look a bit wet. I've gone a little bit over the top actually on the highlight on it, so I've got to tone that down. So you can see I'm using the Doombull brown to tone it down. And there's the finished eye. Well, it's roughly finished. There are a few things I've still got to tweak on it. For example, the hard line around the edge of the iris is too hard if you compare it to the eye on the left that has a softer line. But anyway, that's the end of this video. I hope you enjoyed it, and thank you for watching.